Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for joining us. Today we've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. Under the relentless Afghan sun, Staff Sergeant Marcus Thorne ran a third, needless check on his rifle. The heat was a physical weight, much like the one settling in his gut. At 38, with 2 decades in the military, he'd seen more than his share of war. But this deployment felt different. His daughter, Chloe, now 12, had been ill more often, and his wife, Sarah, had grown distant on their increasingly short phone calls. Marcus wasn't a small man. He stood 6 feet 4 inches, with a frame that looked like it was carved from stone. His cold, gray eyes could make even the most seasoned soldiers uneasy. He'd built his reputation in Iraq and Afghanistan on a simple code. He never abandoned a comrade, but he also never forgot a debt, good or bad. His phone vibrated with an international number. Sarah's name lit up the screen. Marcus. Her voice was thin, but something about it felt practiced. Marcus, I have terrible news. A knot tightened in his stomach. What is it, Sarah? It's Chloe, she said, her voice catching. She's gone. Heart failure. The doctor said it was sudden. She got worse right after you left. Sarah's sobs sounded hollow, almost like an actor's performance. Marcus's world tilted. Chloe had a minor heart condition, but it had always been manageable with medication. She'd been playing soccer just a few months ago. I'm coming home, he said, his voice flat, emotionless. It was a tone that had signaled impending violence in every war zone he'd ever been in. The funeral is Tuesday. I've already made arrangements with... I said I'm coming home. The line went dead. Marcus Thorne lived by 3 principles: absolute loyalty to those who earned it, fierce protection of the innocent, and unwavering retribution for betrayal. As he packed his gear, his thoughts weren't on grief. They were on the strange details in Sarah's story. The timeline, the medical explanation that didn't make sense, and the subtle, unmistakable relief he'd heard beneath her fake sadness. The 18-hour flight from Kabul to Denver gave Marcus all the time he needed to think, and he thought with military precision. Chloe's medical history, which he knew by heart, didn't support a sudden heart failure. Her last video call had shown her looking pale but alert, and Sarah had been acting strangely for months, particularly secretive about her new job at the local medical center. His old Army Rangers buddy, Leo Vance, picked him up from the airport. Leo now worked in private security. Brother, I'm so sorry for your loss, Leo said, pulling him into a tight embrace. But I have to tell you, something's been bothering me. Talk, Marcus said. I've been watching your place like you asked. Sarah's had a visitor. Same car, late nights. It's a pharmacist named David Sharp. He works at the same medical center as her. Marcus's jaw tightened, but his face remained impassive. How long? Started about 2 months after you deployed. Look, I didn't want to be the bearer of bad news when you were worried about Chloe, but now, the house looked exactly as Marcus had left it, except for one subtle detail. The trash cans had been scrubbed clean. In their 15 years of marriage, Sarah had never once deep cleaned a garbage bin. Chloe's room was untouched, but her medical supplies looked incomplete. The new medications Sarah had mentioned in their calls, the ones that were supposedly improving Chloe's condition, were gone. That evening, as Sarah cried in his arms with what felt like a rehearsed performance, Marcus made his first major discovery. In the garage, hidden behind some old paint cans he knew Sarah never moved, were 3 insulin syringes. Sarah wasn't diabetic. Chloe wasn't either. But Marcus knew that insulin injected into a non-diabetic, especially one with a heart condition, could cause a sudden cardiac arrest. Exactly the kind of death that had supposedly taken his daughter. He had learned patience stalking targets in the mountains of Afghanistan, waiting for days for the perfect shot. That same cold, calculated patience settled over him now. He would let Sarah believe her act was working. He would go to Chloe's funeral, and then he would begin the hunt. The sky on Tuesday was as gray as a newly forged blade, perfectly mirroring Marcus Thorne's inner turmoil. As he watched Chloe's small casket disappear into the earth, 2 things struck him. The first was Sarah's tears, which this time were real. Not tears of sorrow, but of suffocating guilt. The second was a man named David Sharp, lingering at the back of the crowd. He wasn't a grief-stricken friend. His eyes, fixed on Sarah, held the possessive, calculated gaze of a co-conspirator. David was younger than Marcus had expected, maybe in his early 30s, with a soft, unremarkable face and a weak handshake that revealed a man who'd never known real danger. Yet, the way his eyes tracked Sarah's every movement, not with distant pity but with a knowing scrutiny, was deeply unsettling. Later, as neighbors and colleagues offered their condolences, Marcus made his second vital discovery. Mrs. Thelma Grant, an elderly neighbor who often watched Chloe, pulled him aside. "Oh, Marcus, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I have to tell you something. That last week, Chloe kept saying her medicine tasted funny. Sarah insisted the doctor changed her prescription, but Chloe was scared. She asked me not to tell her mother. She was even spitting out her pills when Sarah wasn't looking. The old woman's words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His 12-year-old daughter, half a world away, had known something was wrong. She had been fighting for her life while he was unable to protect her. That night, after Sarah had fallen into a deep wine and exhaustion-fueled sleep, Marcus began his true investigation. Sarah's laptop revealed months of meticulously deleted browser history. But Marcus's military intelligence training included basic digital forensics. He painstakingly recovered fragments of searches, insulin overdose symptoms, heart failure in children, and life insurance payout schedules. The final piece of the puzzle was the discovery of a $200,000 life insurance policy on Chloe that Sarah had taken out 6 months before his deployment, and never mentioned. The smoking gun, however, was Sarah's phone. Using his advanced knowledge of surveillance equipment, he recovered text messages between Sarah and David. His blood ran cold as he read them. Sarah. She's getting suspicious about the medicine. Keeps asking why it tastes different. David, just a few more doses. The insulin is tasteless when mixed right. Once her system is compromised, it'll look completely natural. Sarah. What if Marcus finds out? David. He's deployed for 6 more months. By then, we'll have the insurance money and be in Mexico rich and free. Sarah. I never thought it would take this long. She's stronger than we expected. David. Kids are resilient, but her heart can't take much more strain. Maybe 1 larger dose tonight. Marcus read the messages 3 times. His hands steady despite the nuclear-hot rage building within him. They had systematically murdered his daughter over several weeks, torturing her with fear and uncertainty. All for money and a pitiful fantasy of escape. As he sat in Chloe's room, surrounded by her drawings and school awards, Marcus began planning. This wouldn't be simple justice. He wanted them to feel every moment of fear and helplessness that Chloe had. They had made a fatal error. They had underestimated the kind of man they were dealing with. Marcus didn't just want justice. He wanted retribution. For the next week, Marcus played the grieving husband with flawless precision. He attended the counseling sessions Sarah suggested and allowed her to comfort him, even discussing the possibility of an early retirement to start a new life somewhere else. All the while, he meticulously gathered intelligence on both of his targets. David Sharp lived alone in a townhouse on the edge of town. Recently divorced with no children, he was isolated, the perfect target for what Marcus had in mind. Sarah's routine had become predictable. She worked 3 days a week, spent Tuesday evenings at her sister's, and met David at a small bar called Murphy's on Friday nights. Grief support, she told Marcus. But Marcus's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. David's former brother-in-law, a man named Leo. Marcus met him at a veteran support group. Your wife works with David Sharp? Leo asked, his face hardening. That bastard destroyed my sister's life. He stole from her, cheated on her constantly, and when she filed for divorce, he tried to have her declared mentally incompetent to keep their house. She overdosed on sleeping pills before the case went to court. I've always believed he drove her to it deliberately. Leo's words changed everything for Marcus. David wasn't a simple accomplice in a crime of passion. He was a predator who had perfected his methods on vulnerable victims. Sarah might think she was his partner, but Marcus now understood that she was likely his next victim once the insurance money came through. He had to accelerate his timeline. On a Thursday evening, Marcus told Sarah he needed to visit Chloe's grave alone. Instead, he drove to David's townhouse. Using his military-trained lockpicking skills, he slipped in through the back door. David's home revealed a man with expensive tastes and little regard for the law. Behind a fake electrical panel, Marcus found a safe containing vials of stolen medications, including insulin, along with $15,000 in cash and a passport under a different name. The most damning evidence, however, was a laptop containing detailed plans that went far beyond Chloe's murder. David had been plotting to kill Sarah after receiving the insurance payout, making it look like a suicide brought on by grief. He planned to disappear to Mexico with the entire $200,000, leaving Sarah to take the blame for Chloe's death posthumously. Marcus took photos of everything, careful not to disturb the scene. David had even made cold, clinical notes about Sarah's psychological profile, her insecurities, and her drinking habits, calculating exactly how to make her suicide appear credible. As Marcus read the details of David's betrayal, his plan for a quick, brutal justice for Sarah expanded into something far more elaborate. David hadn't just murdered his daughter. He had also been planning to destroy Sarah, leaving Marcus with no one left to hold accountable. Marcus, trained to think tactically and consider all angles, now saw a way to turn David's own plan against him. He would make both conspirators pay not just for Chloe's death, but for the elaborate cruelty they had planned. By the time he left David's townhouse, he had planted 3 surveillance devices and begun the most complex mission of his life. This one was personal, and there would be no rules of engagement. Marcus's military intelligence background had taught him that the most effective combat wasn't physical. It was psychological. To break an enemy's will was to render them defenseless. Watching Sarah and David cling to their charade of shared grief, he began to execute a campaign of mental warfare neither of them would see coming. The first phase was designed to shatter their sense of security. Using the high-tech surveillance equipment his friend Leo Vance provided, Marcus could now record every conversation and analyze every movement between them. Soon, David's townhouse began to have small, unexplainable problems. The security system would arm itself randomly. Lights and electronics would turn on in the middle of the night. Food in the refrigerator, though the appliance worked fine, spoiled overnight. These would be dismissed as coincidences by anyone else, but Marcus knew the cumulative effect of these tiny disruptions would breed deep paranoia. For Sarah, the pressure came from a different source. Marcus began planting Chloe's drawings in places he knew she would find them. Her purse, her car, her work locker. When she'd nervously mention finding them, Marcus would feign confusion, suggesting her grief was affecting her memory. This gaslighting was subtle but persistent. The next phase involved external pressure. Marcus anonymously contacted the insurance company, asking probing questions about the timing of Chloe's death relative to Sarah's new policy and her work at the medical center. The insurance investigator, a man named Roderick Lord, was a professional, and his inquiries made both Sarah and David visibly nervous. But Marcus's masterstroke came from Leo Bishop, David's former brother-in-law. Marcus convinced Leo to file a wrongful death lawsuit against David, claiming he had deliberately driven his sister to suicide. The case was legally weak, but it served its purpose. It put David's past under official scrutiny and drained his resources with legal fees. Under the increasing pressure, David started making mistakes. He called Sarah more frequently, and their conversations grew into heated arguments about keeping their story straight. During one of their recorded calls, David let something slip that made Marcus's blood run cold. "If this gets too hot," he said, "I'm taking the money and disappearing. You can deal with the investigation yourself." "What about our plan?" Sarah's voice was desperate. "What about Mexico?" "Mexico was always my plan, sweetheart," David replied. "You were just the means to get there." Marcus realized that Sarah, for all her complicity, was also being manipulated by a sociopath who saw her as completely disposable. His rage toward her remained absolute. She had, after all, helped murder his daughter, but his plan for David now became far more personal and devastating. The final piece of his psychological assault was a new player. Using his military contacts, Marcus gave anonymous tips to the DEA about medication theft at the medical center. Federal agents began investigating, cutting off both Sarah and David's access to drugs and increasing the pressure on their fragile sense of freedom. By the end of the month, both conspirators were showing signs of severe stress. Sarah had started drinking heavily and was making mistakes at work. David was consumed by paranoia, certain someone was watching him but unable to identify the threat. Marcus, still playing the grieving husband, knew the trap was set. It was time to spring it. The breaking point arrived sooner than Marcus expected. Sarah's drinking had led to her calling in sick regularly, and David's paranoia had made him careless. In a recorded conversation at their usual bar, David made a fatal error. "The insurance investigator is asking too many questions. Maybe we should consider our backup plan." "What backup plan?" Sarah's voice was drunk and confused. "The one where you take all the blame and I disappear," he sneered. "I've got everything I need. Your fingerprints are on the insulin vials, your computer has the searches, and I've been documenting your drinking problems. Suicide brought on by guilt will be an easy sell." A heavy silence followed, broken only when Sarah finally spoke, her voice cold and sober. "You bastard. This was never about us, was it?" "It was always about money, Sarah," David replied. "And you were stupid enough to do the dirty work while I stayed clean." Marcus listened to the conversation from his car outside Murphy's bar, watching through military-grade night vision as Sarah stormed out, leaving David alone at their table. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment their alliance crumbled and they became vulnerable. Using the infiltration skills he had honed in countless missions, Marcus entered the bar through the back. David was drinking heavily, muttering to himself about crazy and amateur partners. He didn't notice Marcus until it was too late. "David Sharp," Marcus said, his voice calm and conversational. David looked up, his alcohol-clouded eyes taking a moment to focus. "Yeah? Do I know you? I'm Marcus Thorne, Chloe's father." All the color drained from David's face. His hand moved toward his phone, but Marcus was already sitting across from him, too close for any sudden moves. "We need to talk," Marcus continued, his voice still pleasant and controlled. "About Chloe, about Sarah, about insulin injections and insurance policies." "I don't know what you're talking about," David stammered, his voice cracking. Marcus pulled out his phone and played the recording of David's conversation with Sarah. As David heard his own voice describing his plan to frame her for murder, his face went white. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus said, leaning in. "You're going to call Sarah and tell her to meet us at my house tonight. You're going to tell her you've decided to come clean and confess to the police together." "Why would I do that?" David asked, desperation in his eyes. Marcus's smile was the same one he'd used when interrogating Taliban prisoners. "Because the alternative is that I kill you right here, right now, and make it look like a bar fight gone wrong. I've killed 17 men in combat, David. Adding one child-murdering piece of garbage to that list won't cost me any sleep." David's hands shook as he reached for his phone. Marcus watched him make the call, listening to his trembling voice convince Sarah to come to the house that had once been her home, the house that still held memories of the daughter they had murdered. As they left the bar together, Marcus felt the cold satisfaction of a plan coming to fruition. David and Sarah thought they understood betrayal. They had no idea they had targeted the wrong man's family. Tonight, they would discover what real betrayal looked like. Chloe deserved more than justice. She deserved vengeance, and Marcus was going to deliver it personally. Marcus's house had been transformed. No longer a home but a stage for his final act. He'd used his military training to prepare the basement, soundproofing it weeks ago. The main floor looked normal, but hidden cameras and recording gear were positioned to capture every moment. Sarah arrived first, a mix of suspicion and desperate hope on her face. David's call had seemed genuine. She found Marcus in the living room, sitting in his old armchair with Chloe's favorite blanket folded neatly on his lap. "Marcus," she said softly. "David said he wanted to meet here. Something about talking to the police." "He'll be here soon," Marcus replied, his voice still carrying the gentle tone of a grieving husband. "Can I get you some coffee? You look tired." Sarah accepted the mug, oblivious to the mild sedative Leo Vance had provided. Marcus wanted her calm, but fully conscious for what was coming. David arrived 20 minutes later, visibly nervous but trying to project an air of confidence. He gave Sarah a brief, stiff hug, a gesture that made Marcus's jaw clench with restraint. "So," David began, sitting across from Marcus, "I've been thinking about Chloe a lot lately. How sudden it all was." "It was sudden," Marcus agreed, his eyes locking on David's. "Almost like someone planned it that way." The room fell silent. Sarah's coffee cup rattled slightly as she set it down. David's practiced expression began to crack. Slowly, Marcus stood and walked to a cabinet Sarah had always thought held family documents. Instead, he pulled out a stack of file folders and his laptop. "Funny thing about being deployed," he said conversationally. "You get a lot of time to think. Time to notice the details that don't add up." He opened the first folder. "Like an insurance policy that gets increased without my knowledge." Sarah's face went white. "Marcus, I can explain." "Please do," Marcus said, his voice remaining calm, though a dangerous edge made them both shift uncomfortably. "Explain why my daughter's insulin supplies were hidden in the garage. Explain why a pharmacist who didn't know my family was at her funeral. Explain why I have recordings of both of you planning her murder." He activated the laptop, and David's voice filled the room. "The insulin is tasteless when mixed right. Once her system is compromised enough, it'll look completely natural." Sarah began to cry, but these weren't the fake tears Marcus had seen for weeks. These were the panicked tears of a woman whose world was collapsing. "How long have you known?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Since the day I came home," Marcus replied. "Chloe told Mrs. Grant she was scared of her medicine. She knew you were poisoning her, and she tried to fight it. My 12-year-old daughter was braver than both of you combined." He opened a second folder, revealing photographs from David's townhouse, copies of his escape plans, and evidence of his past crimes. "Did you know David was planning to kill you next, Sarah? He'd already prepared your suicide note, blaming you for Chloe's death." Sarah turned to David, her face a mask of horror and betrayal. "Is that true?" David's silence was answer enough. "I could have gone to the police weeks ago," Marcus continued. "I have enough evidence to put both of you on death row. But that seemed too simple. You tortured my daughter for weeks before killing her. You made her afraid and you made her suffer while I was thousands of miles away, unable to protect her." He walked over to Sarah, his posture a controlled menace. "So I decided you should both experience exactly what Chloe felt. Fear, helplessness, the knowledge that someone you trusted was planning to destroy you." He turned to David. "How's the paranoia been, David? The sleepless nights? The feeling that someone is always watching?" "That was me. I've been in your house, in your life, documenting every pathetic detail of your existence." David was shaking now, the awful truth finally sinking in. "And Sarah," Marcus's voice grew gentle again, which somehow made it more terrifying. "How's the drinking? The guilt? The constant fear of being caught?" That's been my gift to you. A small taste of the fear our daughter lived with every single day. Marcus sat back down, his movements deliberate and controlled. Now we come to the final phase. You're both going to pay for what you did to Chloe. But first, you're going to help me understand exactly how you planned it, exactly how you made her suffer, and exactly what her last days were like. The basement door opened, and Leo Vance emerged from the shadows, armed and ready. We're going downstairs now, Marcus said, and we're going to have a very long conversation about justice, consequences, and what happens to people who murder children. Neither Sarah nor David moved willingly, but they had no choice. Marcus had planned this moment for weeks. There would be no escape, no mercy, and no forgiveness. Chloe's death would be answered with something far more permanent than legal justice. The basement of Marcus's home had become his personal tribunal, a stark space where he served as judge, jury, and executioner. Restraints, installed weeks ago under the guise of home gym equipment, now held Sarah and David. They sat bound but physically unharmed, facing a wall adorned with photographs of Chloe throughout her brief life. Let me tell you about my daughter, Marcus began, his voice taking on the clipped, formal cadence of a military briefing. Chloe Rose Thorne, born June 15th, 12 years ago. She dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, collected stuffed animals, and gave each one a name and a detailed medical history. Every week, while I was deployed, she wrote me letters, asking about my missions and telling me about her soccer games. He pulled out a worn box of Chloe's letters, each one carefully preserved. In her very last letter, which arrived after she was already gone, she wrote, "Daddy, I don't feel good, and Mommy's medicine tastes funny. When you come home, can we go to a different doctor?" She knew, didn't she? She knew something was terribly wrong. Sarah was openly sobbing now, but Marcus's gaze remained fixed on David, who was struggling to maintain a facade of composure. "David, as the architect of this evil, you get to speak first," Marcus stated. "I want you to explain, in excruciating detail, precisely how you convinced my wife to murder our daughter." "I want a lawyer," David managed, attempting to inject defiance into his voice. Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. "This isn't a trial, David. This is a reckoning." He nodded to Leo Vance. "Leo, show him the syringes." Leo placed a tray of medical instruments on a nearby table, clearly visible to David. Each syringe held a different colored liquid. "These contain insulin, potassium chloride, and succinylcholine," Marcus explained, his voice chillingly calm. "The very same substances you used to torture Chloe, only in more concentrated doses. Now, you can willingly tell me about Chloe's last days, or Leo can start with the insulin while you reconsider your answer." David's composure shattered completely. "It wasn't supposed to take so long," he blurted out. "Sarah said Chloe was getting suspicious, asking questions. I had to use smaller doses to avoid detection." "How long?" Marcus's voice was deadly quiet. 6 weeks, maybe 7. We gave her just enough insulin with her regular medication to gradually weaken her system." Marcus's hands clenched into fists, but his voice remained steady. 7 weeks. You tortured my daughter for 7 weeks while I was fighting a war, believing she was safe at home with her mother." He turned to Sarah, whose face was streaked with tears and terror. "Your turn. Explain to me how a mother murders her own child." "I didn't want to," Sarah screamed. "David said we could start over. He said Chloe would just get sleepy and not wake up. He said it would be painless." "But it wasn't painless, was it?" Marcus pulled out medical records he'd taken from the hospital, emergency room visits, calls to the doctor about fatigue and nausea. "You watched her suffer for weeks, and you kept poisoning her anyway." Marcus walked to a second table, where video recording equipment sat ready. "Here's what's going to happen next. You're both going to record full confessions. Every detail, every moment of planning, every injection you gave her. Everything." "And if we refuse?" David asked, his voice trembling. Marcus's smile was colder than anything David had ever seen. "Then Leo starts with the insulin. We'll see how long it takes for you to change your mind. Chloe lasted 7 weeks. I wonder if you'll last 7 hours." For the next hour, both conspirators provided detailed confessions under Leo's unblinking camera. They described the meticulous planning, the callous execution, and their heartless discussions about Chloe's suffering. When David tried to minimize his role, Leo injected him with a small dose of insulin, sending him into hypoglycemic shock until he agreed to tell the complete truth. By the end, Marcus had everything he needed to destroy both of them, legally and personally. But legal destruction wasn't enough. "Now comes the interesting part," Marcus said, pulling out 2 additional syringes. "These contain the exact same drug cocktail you gave Chloe, but in doses calculated for adult body weight. You're going to experience exactly what she did, except instead of 7 weeks, you get tonight." "You can't do this," Sarah screamed. "I'm Chloe's mother. You were..." Marcus corrected. Now you're just the woman who murdered my daughter for money. Marcus administered the first injection to David himself, watching as the pharmacist's eyes widened with the horrifying realization that he was going to die exactly as he'd killed Chloe. The difference between you and me, Marcus told them both as David began showing the first signs of insulin shock, is that I loved Chloe more than my own life. You loved money more than hers. Sarah received her injection next. Marcus sat back, watching both conspirators experience the fear, the helplessness, and the gradual system failure that his daughter had endured for weeks. Justice might have been served by prison sentences. But this wasn't about justice. This was about ensuring that Chloe's killers understood exactly what they had done, felt exactly what she had felt, and paid the ultimate price for their betrayal. As both conspirators slipped into the final stages of insulin-induced coma, Marcus played Chloe's last video message on repeat. Her voice echoed through the basement as her killers died to the sound of the child they'd murdered asking her daddy when he was coming home. No forgiveness, no redemption. The cleanup took Leo Vance and Marcus 3 hours. Military training included body disposal, and Marcus's connections provided access to a remote location where Sarah and David's remains would never be found. By dawn, all evidence of the previous night's events had been professionally eradicated. Marcus sat in Chloe's room as the sun rose, holding her favorite stuffed animal and reading her last letter one more time. The hollow ache in his chest hadn't lessened, but the consuming rage of weeks had transformed into something colder, more permanent. 3 weeks later, investigator Roderick Lord closed the insurance case when both Sarah and David were officially declared missing persons. The insurance company, faced with a grieving military father and insufficient evidence of fraud, paid out Chloe's policy. Marcus donated every penny to a children's hospital, ensuring that Chloe's memory would help other children live, rather than enrich the people who'd killed her. Leo Bishop approached Marcus at the Veteran Support Group 6 months later. I heard Sarah and David both disappeared around the same time, Leo said carefully. Funny how things work out sometimes. Marcus's expression didn't change. I wouldn't know anything about that. Of course not, Leo agreed. But hypothetically speaking, if someone had made them pay for what they did to Chloe and my sister, I'd want to shake that person's hand. Marcus stood to leave, but Leo's voice stopped him. One more thing. David's ex-wife contacted me last week. Turns out David had a son from a previous relationship. The kid's been in foster care for years. She's trying to get custody. Make sure the boy has a real family. Good for her, Marcus replied flatly. Thing is, Leo continued, the kid keeps asking about his father, wondering why David never came to see him, never called. She's not sure what to tell him. Marcus turned back to Leo, his steel-gray eyes showing no emotion whatsoever. Tell him his father was a coward who abandoned the people who depended on him. Tell him that some people don't deserve forgiveness, and blood doesn't make you family. Tell him to be grateful he didn't grow up knowing what David Sharp really was. Leo nodded slowly, understanding that Marcus Thorne was not a man who believed in redemption for betrayers, regardless of their relationships or circumstances. Marcus left the meeting and drove to Chloe's grave, where he placed fresh flowers every week. As he knelt beside her headstone, he considered the question others seemed to expect him to struggle with. Whether his actions had been justified, whether he should feel guilt or remorse for what he'd done to Sarah and David. The answer came as easily as it always did. Chloe had been innocent, helpless, and dependent on the adults in her life to protect her. Those adults had chosen to murder her for money instead. There was no forgiveness for that betrayal, no redemption possible for that level of evil. Marcus Thorne had been forged in war zones where survival depended on absolute loyalty to your unit and swift, brutal retaliation against those who threatened the innocent. Chloe had been his unit, his mission, his reason for existing. Her killers had declared war on everything he held sacred. They had lost that war completely. As Marcus drove away from the cemetery, he carried with him the same principles that had guided him through 2 decades of military service. Protect those who deserve protection, honor those who earn honor, and destroy those who choose evil. Chloe's memory would live on in his heart, but her killers had been erased from existence as thoroughly as they had tried to erase her life. Some betrayals could never be forgiven. Some crimes could never be pardoned. And some men would never compromise their principles, no matter who stood against them or what relationships were destroyed in the pursuit of absolute justice. Marcus Thorne was one of those men, and he would remain so until the day he joined Chloe in whatever came after this life. The living could plead for mercy, understanding, and forgiveness. The dead deserved better than mercy. They deserved vengeance, and Marcus had delivered it personally. In his world, that was the only justice that mattered. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this. See you next time.